Hi, everyone that is listening in today's session. My name is Danielle Kroll, and I am a medical oncologist and a medical officer on the breast and gynecologic oncology team at the FDA. It is an honor for myself and the entire breast team to be here again this year for our question and answer panel discussion. And on behalf of all of our team members and directors at the FDA, I want to send a big virtual hug and thank you to Sandy Stanford and the Alamo Breast Cancer Foundation, for which this event today would not be possible. And of course, a very special thank you to all of you listening in for being here today. And before I begin with introductions of our team and begin taking questions, I would like to recognize the importance of everyone attending this event. We appreciate your willingness to serve as patient advocates, which is not always an easy job, especially in a rapidly changing healthcare system. You are all intelligent and you all have deep life experiences, which we love learning from. You are constantly educating yourself on emerging research and help bring innovative solutions to cancer research problems. More than ever before, your input is playing an important role in the development of new treatments. We at the FDA are committed to working with patients, and we are very happy to be here today. So this event today is meant to be fun, informative, and really just an opportunity for you all listening to get to meet our team and learn a little bit more about what we do at the FDA. So now, with that said, we will start with introductions. And if everyone could please state your name, your title, and when you joined the FDA, any academic hospital affiliations, even a fun fact about yourself if you wish, that would be great. And we'll begin with Dr. Christy Osgood.
Hi, I'm Christy Osgood. I am, my fun fact is that I am actually a pediatric oncologist, which means breast cancer is kind of a new area for me, but I've really been enjoying working with this fabulous team and learning more about it and all of the patient advocates involved. I am one of the clinical team leaders on one of the breast and GYN teams at the FDA, and I've been at the FDA for a little over 6 years.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Welcome. Next, Dr. Preethi Narayan.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be a part of this today. My name is Preethi Narayan. I'm a medical oncologist and a clinical reviewer on the breast and gynecologic malignancies team here with these lovely people at the FDA. I joined about 3 years ago as a clinical reviewer, and it's been a great experience so far. I'm very happy to be here again. A fun fact about me. I don't know if this is fun, but I grew up in Canada and I moved here for college. So I consider myself a North American person. So glad to be here again.
Great. Thank you, Preethi. Sakar Wabi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sakar Wabi. I am a clinical oncology pharmacist. I joined the FDA 6 years ago. My role at the FDA is reviewing applications and clinical protocols for gynecologic and breast cancer indications. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Great. Thanks. Welcome, Sakar. Dr. Tatiana Prowl.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here with you. I'm Tatiana Prowl. I'm a breast cancer scientific liaison at the FDA and an associate professor of oncology in the breast cancer program at Johns Hopkins. I'm also the daughter of a cancer survivor. And let's see, my fun fact. My fun fact is that I was a languages and literature major in college who took a complete detour to go into medical school, largely as a result of my mom, actually, and some very good college advisor advice. So happy to be here with you all.
Great, thank you. Dr. Christina Bruce.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christina Bruce. I'm a medical oncologist at FDA. I joined 1 year ago in October of 2020. Before that, I was an attending physician at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, and for 6 years. And after that, I was also an attending physician at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Camden, New Jersey. I guess a fun fact about me is that I was also an English major in college, although I was also pre-med at the same time. So I guess it just goes to show those liberal arts degrees are very versatile.
Great. Thanks for being here. And last but not least, Dr. Marat Shah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marat Shah, and I'm a medical oncologist on the breast and gynecologic malignancies team at the FDA. And I also see patients as a supportive oncologist at Johns Hopkins. This is one of my favorite parts of the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. And so I'm really sad that we're doing this virtually instead of in person, but I am thrilled to be part of this session today. And a fun fact about me is that I am an avid bird watcher, and I love answering questions about birds people are seeing coming to their backyard feeders or that they notice on walks around their neighborhoods. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you to our 6 panelists for being able to participate in today's discussion. I know that we have a lot of burning questions from all the advocates listening in person in San Antonio, Texas, and also that may be listening in at home. So we're just going to get right into those questions right now. And we are also taking some live questions in the chat box. If you do have anything additional, please ask away. So I'm going to start with question 1. And question 1 is going to go to Christina. Christina, can you tell us what you do at the FDA? So give an overview of the program for anyone who may be a new patient advocate listening in, who may not know what the breast cancer team at the FDA may do on a daily basis.
Sure. So I'm a medical oncologist by training, and I work as a clinical reviewer on the breast and gynecological malignancies team in the Division of Oncology 1, or what we call DO1 at FDA. The breast and gynecology team is a team of physicians and scientists who review clinical trials that are submitted by drug companies and academic cancer centers. We regulate the approval of new oncology drugs, including chemotherapy and immunotherapy, that are used to treat patients with cancer. Our job is to make sure that these drugs are safe and effective for the US public. The breast and gynecology team is part of the OOD, or Office of Oncological Diseases, at FDA. The OOD has several specialty teams that are responsible for different types of cancers. For example, the Division of Oncology 2, or DO2, focuses on lung cancers and brain cancers. We also have specialty teams that focus on hematological malignancies such as leukemias and lymphomas. The Office of Oncological Diseases is part of CDER, or the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. FDA has 3 centers that review drugs, biologics, and devices that are used for patients with cancer. These include the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, and the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, or CDRH. The OCE, or the Oncology Center of Excellence, is a center at FDA whose goal is to facilitate communication between these 3 centers and help expedite the development and clinical review of oncology products. The OCE was established in 2017 as part of the Biden Moonshot Initiative and was authorized by the 21st Century Cures Act.
Great. Thank you, Christina, for that overview of the day in the life of a medical officer for the FDA. I think that we can move on to question 2 that came in. So we received a question from an advocate, really great question here, asking if we can explain what is an accelerated approval versus a regular approval. So this is a great question. This question, I think there's that about this and the differences. And also, when was this program launched? So Preethi, do you mind explaining a little bit about the process of an accelerated approval versus a regular?
That's a great question. So accelerated approval was actually a program that was started in 1992. And it was in response to the ongoing AIDS and HIV crisis at the time. And the whole purpose of the program is to try to get promising therapies to patients faster, that show good safety, good efficacy, so that they're not held up longer than needed in review time. So that was really the origins of the program. And so the requirements for accelerated approval include serious and life-threatening diseases. And cancer, of course, is essentially one of those. We want trials that show an endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict benefit. So it may not be a direct measure of clinical benefit, but overall can show us that eventually it may show a strong clinical benefit. We want that assurance. Sometimes we call that a surrogate endpoint. And usually we look at endpoints that may not be like overall survival that we know is a direct indicator of clinical benefit, but what we call surrogate endpoints that may show evidence of an earlier benefit. One of the other really important things for accelerated approval is that we look at all the therapies that are already approved for that population or for that indication to make sure that this therapy is what we call substantially better. And those will all lead to hopefully potentially an accelerated approval. Now, on the other hand, we have another pathway that's known as regular approval that you guys may have heard about. And that can be granted if a drug is showing already a direct measure of clinical benefit, maybe an overall survival benefit. In the case of a regular approval, we don't need to be better than available therapies. So as long as the therapy showed in its clinical trial that it was safe and effective and better than maybe the therapy it was compared to, then it can get a regular approval. One other thing I want to mention is that the clinical measures that we think of providing clinical benefit is anything that helps you feel, function, or survive better. So I hope that answers the question for accelerated versus regular approval.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Preethi, for that explanation. Now, can you actually give me an example of a drug that may have went through this process of accelerated approval and then had gained full approval?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question too. So we have a couple of examples in breast cancer, certainly. A lot of you may be familiar with a drug called sacituzumab govitecan. This was initially granted accelerated approval because at the time we had a trial that was what we call a single arm trial, meaning it was not compared to another drug, but that showed what we felt was meaningful benefit based on overall response rate, which is a measure of how a tumor responds. So we granted accelerated approval based on that, and that was for in the metastatic setting after 2 lines of therapy. Based on that, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is when we do grant an accelerated approval, we may require what we call a confirmatory trial. So a confirmatory trial is just a way to confirm that benefit that we think we're already seeing when we grant the accelerated approval. And in the case of sacituzumab, a randomized large trial was done. And that trial actually was done in an earlier setting, meaning after 1 line of therapy. And so when we reviewed that trial data, it was not only converted to regular approval, but we moved it up by 1 line. So that's another benefit of accelerated approval. Sometimes when we convert it, we can move it to an earlier line if the trial has shown evidence of that. Other examples that many of you may be familiar with is pembrolizumab plus chemotherapy in the metastatic setting. Those are for tumors that have what we call a PD-L1 expression greater than or equal to 10%. That was approved and then initially under accelerated approval and then was converted to regular approval. Another example that I can just give you that's still under accelerated approval is trastuzumab deruxtecan or TDXD. We are still waiting on confirmatory trial results, some of which are already being reported at San Antonio. And then once we start to review that, potentially may see whether that qualifies for a regular approval.
Great.
And one other thing, sorry, I'll mention very quickly is accelerated approval does work in many cases. And sometimes though, we do see accelerated approvals that we do withdraw from the market. An example of this that many of you are aware of is atezolizumab. And we look at a lot of things for that. One, if the confirmatory trial is not able to confirm benefit. And also, as you guys can see, the treatment landscape is rapidly changing. So sometimes what we give an accelerated approval to just does not apply, down the line once we get confirmatory evidence.
Great. Thanks, Preethi. I'm glad you mentioned that at the end. There was a question in the chat regarding, if these trials are, depending on how the results are, what does the FDA do? With these accelerated drugs, Preethi, you mentioned in detail a lot of what we look for. But I have a question from an advocate that came in and wants to know what else we are looking at in terms of not just safety, safety being incredibly important for review of these trials, but in these drugs, accelerated drugs, what is the FDA looking at in addition to adverse events, serious adverse events? So the safety profile. Marat, are you able to help us out with that one?
Sure. So I wanted to, this is a great question, and I wanted to mention that, with drugs that we're considering for accelerated approval and drugs that we're considering for regular approval, what we're really doing is trying to form some kind of understanding of what are the benefits of this drug and what are the potential risks to people who receive this drug, and trying to decide, do the benefits outweigh the risks, and is it the right thing to do to have this drug be available on the market? And so, in either an accelerated or regular approval, some of the ways in which we assess benefit may be, how many people receive this drug and how many people experience their tumors shrink and how long did that last. That's one type of way that we could assess clinical benefit. Or how many people received this drug and how long were they able to continue to have their disease stay stable or even shrink without growing or without developing new sites of disease with this drug compared to a different drug. And as Danielle mentioned, safety is a really important part of the benefit risk assessment. We consider what are the most serious side effects that people experience, but also what are some things that maybe don't lead to hospitalization, but could be really bothersome on a daily basis. And how often do people have to change the dose of the drug or stop taking the drug because of safety? We look at all of that data to make a decision about whether we should approve a drug or not. And then I wanted to mention another thing that's important, which is that we're making a decision kind of for a whole group of people with a certain type of cancer, but really it's up to each individual person and their doctor and their other providers to decide. The FDA has said that this can be on the market, but does it make sense for me to be taking this drug?
Right.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, if anyone else had anything to mention about that, but I think you really hit on some high points as, other things that we're doing in the review process as part of this to make determinations about risk and benefit profiles. Okay. So the next question I have from an advocate, the advocate would like to know how doses are established in clinical trials. So this is also great. So many great questions, guys. So how do we establish a dose that we're going to eventually use, during the approval process? So Sakar, if you don't mind talking a little bit about how doses are established in clinical trials.
Sure. Thank you for the question. In the initial trial in humans, the first dose is based on doses of the drug in animal studies. Using complicated formulas and calculations, the first dose in humans is determined. Then in the phase 1 clinical trials, increasing dose levels of the drug is given to a small cohort of patients, assessing for tolerability and adverse event information in the phase 1 trial until the maximum tolerated dose is established. From this information we obtain from the phase 1 trial, the recommended phase 2 dose is driven. And it's usually by analyzing drug exposure in humans, meaning looking at drug concentrations, what we call pharmacokinetics, and how the drug is engaging the target, usually for targeted therapies. meaning the effect of the drug on the human body, which we call a pharmacodynamic profile of the study drug. Also, we take into consideration the tolerability and adverse event data that are accumulated in the phase 1 trial. All these factors help in determining the recommended phase 2 dose. Sometimes further dosing studies is done in phase 2 trials when there are uncertainties regarding which dose is the most safe and effective to be given in the phase 3 trials, which are the registrational trials where hundreds to thousands of patients are treated. And ultimately, the dose for approval for marketing authorization of that product is the dose that's given in the phase 3 trials if the phase 3 trials succeed and prove to be safe and effective in the population it was studied for. I hope this clarifies how doses are established in clinical trials and ultimately for approval to be put on the market.
Great. Thank you, Sakar, for going into detail about that. We have a great question that came through the chat box. And the question is, does the FDA's Medwatch program for self-reporting, has that had much of an impact on approvals or removals? Great question. So I'm going to turn that over to our team to talk a little bit about what Medwatch is for everyone listening that may not know what that program is, and talk a little bit about the impact that it has. And anyone on the team able to take that question?
I'm happy to start, and then please everybody chime in. So that's a great question. Medwatch is available online. It's a link where anyone can report any safety concerns to the FDA on a patient level. So, you know, if for instance, oftentimes we get reports from investigators about a patient that may have had a adverse event, and then what happened with that. And certainly if we get enough, we monitor those reports. So those reports come into us, and each of us reviewers do monitor a number of these reports under different drug products. If we do notice a trend where we're getting the same type of report over and over, for instance, you know, something is causing a lot of liver toxicity, certainly, you know, we either from the FDA side, we can ask the company to provide us more information, and that can lead to label changes, possibly can lead to, depending what the nature is. We had with the CDK inhibitors, we had a class labeling where we were seeing the same thing happen across all the drugs. So there was a class labeling for pneumonitis, which is lung toxicity. So maybe I'll pause there in case anybody else from the team has any other thoughts on this, but it is a great question, and we do encourage use of the system.
I'll just add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just sorry. I couldn't unmute myself. So sorry about that. I just wanted to add that, you know, this is a really important mechanism for us to learn about the safety for a drug. Sometimes when we look at drugs in clinical trials, because of the way the clinical trial has been conducted, we might have safety information on a few hundred people, but then a few, you know, up to thousands of people will get the drug after we approve it. And so if there's a really rare safety signal, sometimes even in the best clinical trial, that just wouldn't have been detected before we approve a drug. And this is such an important way for us to learn about, you know, how the drug is affecting people in the real world, and then updating the label with that safety information so that everybody can be aware.
Yeah, I was just going to give a quick example, not from oncology, but, you know, the example of these very rare cases of myocarditis that we've heard about, or these very rare types of blood clots with different types of the vaccines for COVID. And, you know, these are extremely rare events. Same with anaphylaxis, you know, severe allergic reactions with some of the types of vaccines. These are things that occur in, you know, 1 in tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people. So if you do a clinical trial that has, you know, 40 or 50,000 people in it, even, which is much larger than anything we're doing in oncology, if you have a 2 in a million side effect, the odds that you're going to see that in the clinical trial are low. And so this is just an important mechanism to ensure that not only doctors, but also patients, people receiving these drugs, can notify us of something that might have been missed in the development program through no one's fault, just the fact that not enough patients had been exposed yet. So it is a very important mechanism. I do think that if you're going to report there, and certainly I encourage you to do that if you have an unexpected side effect of a treatment, I do think that the more information you can provide, the better. One of the challenges that we have is sometimes those reports are very incomplete, and it makes it really difficult for us to know if what happened is related to the treatment that you have taken or related to something else. So, particularly if we don't know what other medicines people are on, or we don't know what other medical problems they have, it becomes very difficult to know if that's a true safety signal or just, a coincidence that you happen to be on this drug and something happened.
Yeah. Those are some really helpful points about Medwatch. I hope that that did help the advocates understand, this program a little bit better, the importance of it. All right, that was really excellent. Thank you all. All right, so we have another really another great question coming from an advocate. And I love this question. How can advocates help the FDA, and what programs can advocates be involved in? So great question. And Tatiana, actually, why don't you continue speaking, if you don't mind taking this question and talking a little bit about how advocates can help.
Sure. So I'm not in the room with any of you, but I've worked with a lot of you who I know are in this virtual room for a long time. And so many of you probably could answer this question even better than I can. But the truth is that we work with advocates in many ways. We frequently will have mini symposia, which are small meetings internal to the FDA that are focused on a particular topic, like, for example, drug development in metastatic breast cancer, or unique issues related to premenopausal women in breast cancer clinical trials, or something like that. So we will commonly have patient advocates be involved as a part of that. We also have patient advocates as speakers when we have public workshops, so larger meetings that are actually open to anyone and in normal time on the FDA campus. And then in addition to that, we interact with all of you normally at conferences when we can travel. We interact with you at conferences, we interact with you on social media and on other mechanisms, just to hear sort of a real world experience on what the areas of unmet need are in your particular stage of disease or your particular breast cancer subtype, how the tolerability and safety of a drug is playing out in the real world. Because again, in clinical trials, you're all sitting there at San Antonio, you're watching it on your screen, and you see investigators say that something was tolerable or manageable. And I'm sure many of you who are on these drugs are thinking, it doesn't feel very tolerable to me. I've had to get up several times and go to the bathroom this morning while I've watched these sessions or whatever. So I think it's very helpful to us to hear from advocates about what may be toxicities that are rare, but they're not rare when they're happening to you. Or you may be telling us about something that is a low-grade toxicity, but that goes on for months and months and months, that becomes really, a major issue in terms of compromising your quality of life, preventing you from working or being able to do your usual day-to-day things. So that's another way. We do utilize advocates in a more formal way as well. So when we have a drug that is that we're making an approval decision about, that's the most common reason we would convene one of these meetings, but they go to advisory committee meetings. So in oncology, that's called ODAC, or Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee meeting. And when we go to those are basically a public forum where we have a panel of experts. These will include academic oncologists, they'll include statisticians, but one of the people that we actually have on there is a patient representative. And they're basically weighing in on the safety and efficacy data for a drug as we're making a decision about whether or not to approve it. So they're formally represented there. And then the final issue is, I guess, patients often will help us identify initiatives that we need to work on. So, for example, Kelly Shanahan, I don't know if she's on here, but Dr. Shanahan is a gynecologist who's also living with metastatic breast cancer. And she is one of the first people that actually really put on my radar screen that we needed to be working to decentralize clinical trials. She approached me at San Antonio, I think it's probably been 4 years ago now, right after a session, and said, hey, we're really excited about all of the work that you guys are doing to modernize eligibility criteria. But the biggest barrier to getting people in clinical trials is that they can't get to the trial. There are people living in areas where there's no trial site nearby, or people cannot miss that much work, or they don't have childcare, or they can't afford to go back and forth to Boston to get their scans done and have their doctor visits. And she really catalyzed a movement within FDA that's not limited to oncology, and that has been expedited a lot by this pandemic, to try to decentralize elements of clinical trials wherever possible. So that meant if we could do visits via telemedicine, great, let's do that. If some of those scans and labs can be done locally and you don't need to bring a patient to an academic center that may involve travel for them, great, let's do that. Can we collect vital signs via the wearable devices that they already have anyway, and so forth? So that, just a few examples, but advocates really inform our work every day. And I want all of you guys to know that everything that you tell me, I'm bringing that to the table every day. So you may not feel like you're sitting at the table, but you are represented at the table unequivocally.
Particularly by Dr. Prowl.
And Kelly is on, and Kelly is listening. So, all right, that is really, really great. I mean, so many great points there with, ways advocates can get involved. And everyone knows Tatiana and her involvement with all of these advocate organizations. And, even, our whole team thanks you, Tatiana. You've done a tremendous job with working with the advocates over the years. And we know we all appreciate that. But that was really a great detail about ways that advocates can get involved, some programs that everyone can be a part of. So I appreciate you explaining some of those things. There was some mention in the chat about some meetings being opened or closed. So I may have lost audio, but I can take that. Some meetings, some of the things we invite the advocates to be a part of at the FDA may be a closed, very small, intimate discussion. But there are the public workshops that were mentioned that, really are a great way for advocates to be involved in open meetings. So yes, there are open and closed meetings with advocates. There was a question in the chat. Let me see if I can find it regarding, oh goodness. Okay, so regarding economics. So can the FDA assess the economic rationality of new drugs? Christy, do you mind just talking maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is somewhat a brief answer, which is that no, we do not assess the impact of pricing and or the economic rationality of developing a new drug. That is left up to all sorts of different people that is well outside of our purview. So we basically look at drugs without a thought about the economics. And we, I think the end of that question was also sort of like, do you see this changing in the future? At this time, no, I don't see this changing in the future. I know there's conversations in Congress and other places where these issues are constantly being discussed. And as a patient advocate, there's always hopefully a chance to engage with with your representatives and that sort of a thing. But in general, we don't that's well outside of our purview. But we do get asked this question quite frequently.
Right. We do. Yeah. Thanks for taking that question. All right, I have another really great question coming in from an advocate regarding exclusion criteria for clinical trials. Really great question. So why is exclusion criteria important in clinical trials? And the second part of this question is, how can we learn more about brain mets if they are excluded in so many trials? The same goes with too many lines of prior therapy. or even comorbidities. So great question about inclusion, exclusion criteria. And Christy, if you don't actually mind continuing to your discussion, if you can talk a little bit about why exclusion criteria is so important in clinical trials.
Yeah, so I actually treat this more as eligibility criteria and why it's so important in clinical trials, because it's not only the exclusion criteria, but it's also the inclusion criteria. And we look at this very closely in all clinical trials that we assess at the FDA. When it's an early phase trial or early in the drug's development, we look very closely at who they're planning to include and are they going to be able to find a dose and all of that information. And then as the trial and the development proceeds, we look more closely at who are they including in this trial, and is it the appropriate patient population that they should be investigating this drug in? Will they have an effect on that patient population? And are they including the right patients so that we can compare them appropriately to the US population and ensure that any data they get will be useful? Because again, very importantly, we want to approve drugs that will be useful for the right patients, and our most valuable resource is the patients. And so if we're enrolling patients that are not reflective of our population, then there's not much we can do with that information. So we actually take a very close look at both inclusion and exclusion criteria throughout the drug development process. And it's really important just to ensure that we are enrolling the correct patients. I think as far as things like brain metastases, we absolutely agree with you. And we have many working groups at the FDA going, looking at who to include in clinical trials and how honestly to broaden criteria. And that goes for not only brain metastases, because you're right, if we're not looking at patients with brain metastases, how are we ever going to know what drugs are going to help them? But it also goes for patients who have other underlying comorbidities like HIV, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and or underlying renal dysfunction. And we are looking at broadening the exclusion and exclusion criteria as much as we possibly can to be as inclusive as we can, but also to study an appropriate population. We've written multiple guidances for the pharmaceutical industry that are completing these trials. And as far as prior lines of therapy go, I think that has more to do with are you reflective of the U.S. population and what will be the final indication for the drug? So we want to ensure that, we know this drug works in you and sort of the population they're enrolling can be indicated because it's homogeneous enough that we can actually and homogeneous like same, that we can actually provide an approval for the drug on the other end and get this drug to patients sooner.
Yeah. That's great, Christy. Thanks for the explanation. And we're well aware that this is a real world problem. This is really happening in the clinic when patients are being talked to with their provider about, entering into a clinical trial and whether or not they're meeting the appropriate, inclusion to do so. Does anyone else on the team have any additional comments regarding inclusion, exclusion? I know this is a really big topic that everyone really wants some clarification on.
I can just weigh in on this briefly. So, Christy's alluded to this already, but there were these working groups through ASCO and Friends of Cancer Research Advocacy Organization and FDA that started back about 4 or 5 years ago that put out a whole series of papers on how to include patients more broadly in clinical trials. So still protecting participants' safety, but making sure that we learn about the intended use population. So we are seeing a lot more industry sponsors of clinical trials actually adopting these recommendations. Now we've seen the NCI actually modify their entire protocol template so that it incorporates these recommendations. So all NCI sponsored trials are much more inclusive than they were 5 years ago. And we're starting to see now, I'm sure you guys have heard in the last 24 hours, several results about activity of drugs in brain metastases. And we had nothing like that 5 years ago because those patients simply were not included, despite the fact that, for example, in HER2 positive breast cancer or triple negative breast cancer, you may have half or even more than half of that metastatic patient population developing brain metastases over the course of their illness. So we really did not have a lot of information about the intended use population. And I think all of us have been very clear that that is not acceptable, that the experiment, if you will, is going to happen. It's just a question of, does it happen in a clinical trial where we're learning from it and where patient safety is maximized, or does it happen in somebody's infusion center when they just give a drug to patients with brain mets, and we have no idea how well it will work, and we have no idea what the safety issues may be. So it's really exciting to see some of that work from 5 years ago now starting to manifest in real differences. We now have clinical trials being done in patients with leptomeningeal disease. That wasn't happening 5 years ago. We now have trials routinely, including patients with brain mets. We now have almost all breast cancer trials in the US, and to the extent that we can impact the ones happening globally, allowing men to enroll, men with breast cancer, males with breast cancer, I should say. So it's very exciting. And I think that you guys should give yourselves a lot of credit for that, because some of that work really happened because all of you said, hey, I really want to be in a clinical trial. You're telling me that only 5% of adults go in clinical trials. We want to be in there, but you have to make these trials open to us. So, that's really a credit to all of you who've contributed to that work.
And just to note that this is a work in progress. We still see areas for improvement, and we are constantly working with sponsors to try to get them to broaden inclusion and exclusion criteria. And sometimes they don't, but we are definitely working every day towards doing this. And we do appreciate everyone's support and saying, we want to enroll, we want to help answer these questions. So.
Yeah, really great points. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Tatiana. And there was a question that came in the chat about how, back to a couple of questions ago, about how advocates can get involved. So how can advocates get involved in the public workshops? Can anyone take that one?
I can get started, but I'd love to hear from everybody else too on the panel. But yeah, absolutely. We really love actually having advocates on as many of our panels as we can, especially even like Danielle mentioned, we have some that are more closed meetings. And often when we close meetings, it's more to industry, but we have advocates on closed and open panels, public workshops. We usually try to reach out, but we highly encourage if you also have suggestions, people. In fact, Christy and I are helping to plan one now, and we got great suggestions from our advocates that we reached out to saying, this is somebody we'd love to see. And actually, that's how we're pulling somebody onto a future panel. So we always are really encouraging. Please reach out to us. Let us know if you think there's somebody great. Some of us are on Twitter, and so we try to follow as many of you as possible. So yeah, in other words, we want to see really not just patient advocate involvement, but a diverse panel, because we want to hear, what are the things that are bothering, specific, maybe, something that specific advocates are noticing versus others. So, I'll open that up in case everybody else has thoughts about that too.
There was a related question about how do you get to attend advisory committee meetings. So those are, as I said, in normal times, they physically take place on the FDA campus, and you can come as a visitor and go to them, but they're also broadcast live virtually, and that was true even before the pandemic, so that will be true after the pandemic as well. And if you just search for Oncologic Drugs Advisory Committee, or if you just put in your browser ODAC, ODAC, and then Oncology, because apparently ODAC stands for something different too, ODAC and Oncology, you'll see a meeting, and you can actually see the background materials. You can sign up to actually give public testimony. You can get a short period of time during the public testimony portion of the meeting if you want to say something formally, or you can just get the link and attend if you're just interested in hearing the discussion. But those are open to absolutely anyone. You don't have to be invited to those to participate or to join. If you want to participate, you do have to register in advance as a public speaker.
Yeah, great. All right, really, really helpful information for those workshops. Thank you, guys. All right, we have another really great question that came in from an advocate regarding patient-reported outcomes. So the question is, are you encouraging oncologists to look at patient-reported outcomes? And if negative, to report their data safety and monitoring board or IRB. So Christina, if you don't mind talking a little bit about maybe for those that may not know what a patient-reported outcome is and how important they are, and whether or not, or should I say, what our role at the FDA is regarding discussing with oncologists. Are we encouraging the use of PROs?
Sure. Patient-reported outcomes are a very important part of cancer drug development and research. Patient-reported outcomes focus on patients' direct experiences of a cancer drug and the impact that it has on their daily functioning and quality of life. The Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA has a patient-focused drug development program, which works with both patients and physicians to assess how to best report patient symptom data. In June of 2021, FDA released a guidance document for researchers and physicians, which focused on the use of patient-reported outcomes in cancer clinical trials. We encourage oncologists to look at patient-reported outcomes, and we always encourage patients and physicians to report any adverse effects from cancer treatments to their individual Data Safety Monitoring Board or their individual IRB.
Great, thanks, Christina. Yes, and as a lot of listening in, PROs have really become such an important topic for us, even more so over the last few years, such that we now have teams and groups formed at the FDA that work solely on PROs. It's really become a very important topic, and we as a team also believe that it's an important part of the process, and that we absolutely encourage oncologists to look at these things. So thanks for that question from the advocate. That was a great question. So all right, and again, we encourage you to be writing in the chat any other questions that you have. I do have one question that came in from an advocate. Let's see. This one is regarding serious adverse events. So what if one of the drugs you find has serious adverse events, but it does work in a small, significant group of patients? What can that patient do to stay on the drug that may be helping him or her? That's a really, really great question. We do have encountered that question before, from meeting you advocates, on a one-on-one basis. But this is a great platform to discuss that. So Preethi, if you don't mind talking about a little bit about what the FDA perspective is on, if there's anything, what can the patient do to stay on a drug that may be helping him or her, but there are serious adverse events with the drug?
That's a really great question, and I think it's great that it was brought up for this session. Yes, absolutely. When we get any data from a trial, we are looking really closely at the safety. We want to make sure. Again, is the safety something that we can accept, because there's going to be side effects, but is it an acceptable amount, and certainly very serious SAEs we have to take. Those are serious adverse events. Those are events that could cause potentially hospitalizations, long-term effects. Those are things we really look at very closely, because if it's something that can be managed or prevented in some ways, we do our hardest to add those things to the label. However, if it's something that rises to the level where it's starting to look unacceptable for the benefit that potentially that drug is providing, that's an area we might have to restrict certain parts of the indication. And that's sometimes why you see that. In a trial, we do our best to look at what we call subgroups. That means groups of patients that may have benefited more from the drug than another group, and we try to balance that. You guys have heard a lot about when we say benefit risk analysis, and it's really just kind of a seesaw that we try to look at. Is there a group that is going to benefit more, that we can maybe in some ways justify that safety risk? So that's as far as the labeling and our review of the trials. the question about whether if you're on a trial maybe and you're benefiting from a drug, but they're seeing some serious adverse events in that trial, I would say to talk to, your healthcare provider, because sometimes there's ways to work out with the or trials even have it written in. There's ways to continue a drug if you are deriving benefit, because as someone mentioned earlier, the FDA is looking at this on a population trial level, but we absolutely understand that there are patients that may be getting benefit from certain drugs. So I would say, talk to your healthcare provider. There are ways sometimes to continue receiving that drug even once you're off the trial. And I don't know if others have thoughts about that too, because that's a very good question.
Yeah.
Maybe we should probably just put in a plug for Project Facilitate. If anybody's not familiar with that, and we can share this information. I'm sorry we can't actually respond to any of you writing questions in the chat, like in text, but there's a project called Project Facilitate, which is basically like a concierge service that either patients or their physicians can access to gain access to help from FDA with applying for compassionate use of a drug so a drug you can't access. It's not approved for your type of cancer. It's not available to you through a clinical trial. But this is a drug that we have reason to think might benefit you. There's a process to do that called compassionate use or expanded access. And this project called Project Facilitate actually provides a phone number where you can call during normal business hours. A live human actually picks up within a couple of rings. I've called just to see. It actually really works. And they will help you find the pharmaceutical company contact, complete the form that's needed to do that, and find an IRB if you're being treated at a place that doesn't have an IRB that they already work with, an institutional review board that reviews those sorts of requests for safety and ethical issues. So there are a lot of mechanisms to access drugs, even if they're not available to you through clinical trials or through the approval process, if they are benefiting you or there's a strong rationale to think that they would.
Yeah, that's great.
And Marjorie, thank you so much for providing it in the chat.
Yes,
the link.
I was just going to say that. Thank you for putting that link.
They also have an email if you would prefer, which is all, and their phone number is right on that website that Marjorie just provided.
Yeah, great. And I do have another question, and it's kind of ties into the last question actually about are we looking at who is benefiting from a drug? So the question that's coming in from an advocate is, does the FDA look at who is specifically benefiting from a drug, such as women of color? So this is a really great question, and we can absolutely touch on the importance of demographics and patient characteristics in a clinical trial. So Sakar, do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. I can touch on the subject, and thank you for the question. We do certainly look at who's benefiting from a drug. When we review proposed clinical trials at different stages of clinical development, be it phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trials, and also at time of data when the results are available after the trial is completed, we look at results based on patient demographics and patient characteristics, including looking at efficacy and safety results by age, gender, or by race. We also look at differences in efficacy and safety in what we call subgroups in the trial, which could be in different disease characteristics of the tumor, such as disease histology, or it could be different tumor subtypes, such as biomarker positive versus negative, and so on. Or this helps us, guides us actually in our regulatory decisions when reviewing clinical trial results. I believe Dr. Prowell touched on this earlier. FDA also has published guidance for pharmaceutical industry, which is available online, guiding sponsors of drugs and biologics to be inclusive of a diverse patient population when enrolling in clinical trials, to include minorities and older patients, and also patients with brain metastases. And another example is including men in breast cancer clinical trials. So this is all to further broaden the eligibility requirements when enrolling patients. I hope this sheds some light on what we take into considerations when we review applications and clinical protocols.
Thanks, Sakar. Yeah, I feel like any of the new advocates tuning in are Googling guidances right now to read them. They are public, and we really do encourage you to look at them. And these are the actual documents that we are sending to industry. So again, all you need to do is Google FDA guidance for industry, and you'll be able to get access to these. But those were some really great examples, Sakar. Thanks for that, providing those. But yeah, those were some great examples. So this really has been a great session, and I think that we've approached our hour. Unfortunately, it always goes by so quickly. Again, we as a team, we love doing this event. We love being here for you guys, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do it in person and not virtually. We are just really wanting to hug you all. We've missed seeing you. And I'll just open it up to the breast team right now if there was any other closing comments that you would like to make. But this ends our session.
Guess
thank you
all
all
about the guidance page.
Lots of comments.
Yeah, so go to the guidance page. If you just look up Oncology Center of Excellence and guidances, you can see them. When they first come out, there's actually a public comment period that goes on for, is it 60 or 90 days? I think it's 60 days, where you can actually put your comments in there, and we read every single one of them, and we revise those in response to what you say. So that's yet another place that patient advocates can have an impact on our decision making and on the advice that we're giving pharmaceutical companies designing clinical trials that enroll you.
Mm-hmm. And all I have to say is thank you all for being advocates and for engaging with us and helping us to hopefully provide better information to the public, to the pharmaceutical industry, and just thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure to be here today. And that concludes our FDA advocate question answer session. And thanks all for joining.